My husband kept a second set of car keys I'd never seen. The car they belonged to wasn't his. I want to start with the drawer, because that's where I found them, an ordinary Saturday morning, looking for a phone charger in the small catch-all drawer in our kitchen, when my fingers closed around a set of keys attached to a worn leather fob I didn't recognize. Not our car, not either of our parents' cars, not anything I could place. When I asked my husband about them that evening, he went quiet in a way I had rarely seen and asked if we could sit down together before he explained. Hello, my name is Sarah, and this is the story of a set of car keys I found by accident after 11 years of marriage, a truck that belonged to no one currently living in our family, and the quiet, patient faith my husband had been keeping alive behind them for longer than I'd known him at all. This isn't a story about a hidden vehicle or a secret life. This is a story about a man named Ray, a truck that once belonged to their father, and the particular kind of love that keeps a door open for someone, even when every reasonable person around you says it's time to finally close it. I think you should understand, before I describe finding those keys, what kind of man my husband Nathan was, because I don't want you to imagine ours was a marriage clouded by real suspicion. Nathan was steady and transparent in nearly every part of his life, generous with information, easy to reach, never once giving me reason to wonder where he was or what he was doing. That single unfamiliar set of keys was the one unexplained thread in an otherwise open life, which is exactly why it unsettled me the way it did. I want to say, too, that our marriage had never given me reason to search through drawers or closets with any real suspicion. We shared nearly everything openly, our schedules, our finances, the small daily details of our lives, and it was precisely because that openness had never been tested that a single unfamiliar keychain, tucked so casually among rubber bands and old receipts, struck me as strange enough to ask about at all. Nathan and I met in our late 20s at a friend's housewarming party and married 3 years later in a small backyard ceremony. He had mentioned early in our relationship that he had a younger brother named Ray, though I met Ray only twice in our first several years together, both times briefly, both times under circumstances that felt, even then, a little strained. I understood in a general way that Ray struggled with addiction, that the relationship between the two brothers had grown distant and complicated over the years, but Nathan rarely offered more detail than that, and I had learned, gently, not to push too hard on a subject that so visibly weighed on him. I asked Nathan about the keys that Saturday evening, expecting perhaps an old set from a car we'd long since sold, something forgotten and harmless. Instead, he told me, quietly, that they belonged to his father's old pickup truck, the same truck his father had driven for over 20 years before he passed away, a truck that Nathan had kept, unused and carefully maintained, in a rented garage space across town for nearly a decade. I felt, in that first moment, more confusion than alarm. Why would anyone pay to store and maintain a truck no one drove for 10 years without ever once mentioning it? Nathan told me he would explain everything, but asked for a little patience while he found the right way to say it, and something in his careful, deliberate tone told me the fuller story would take more than a single evening to fully unfold. I remember lying awake that same night, running through every possibility I could invent, wondering whether the truck belonged to some part of Nathan's past he'd never mentioned, an old friend, a debt, a chapter of his life I somehow knew nothing about after 11 years together. None of the possibilities I imagined that night came anywhere close to the quiet, patient truth waiting to be told, though I want to be honest that the not knowing itself was its own small, restless kind of difficult, a low hum of uncertainty that colored the following days until the fuller explanation finally arrived. We sat together that night while he began explaining, though I want to be honest that the complete picture only emerged slowly across several following conversations, each one adding another careful layer to a story far larger and more tender than I could have guessed from that first unfamiliar keychain. Ray, Nathan told me, was 3 years younger and had struggled with substance addiction since his early 20s, a battle that had cost him, over the years, 2 marriages, several jobs, and long stretches of estrangement from nearly everyone in the family, except Nathan himself. Their father, Gerald, had died when Ray was deep in one of his hardest periods, unable even to attend the funeral in any state that allowed him to say a proper goodbye, a loss that Nathan told me Ray had never fully recovered from, layering fresh grief on top of years of shame he already carried. Nathan described their childhood briefly that evening too, the two of them close as boys despite the 3-year gap. Gerald, a patient, hard-working man who ran a small auto repair shop and taught both his sons to work on engines before either of them could legally drive. He told me Ray had always been the more restless of the two, quick to charm, quick to trouble, and that their father had spent years trying different approaches: firmness, patience, tough love, quiet forgiveness, searching for whatever combination might finally reach him. Nothing had worked completely, not before Gerald's death, though Nathan said his father had never once, in all those difficult years, stopped believing his younger son was capable of turning things around eventually. He told me about the specific texture of Ray's worst years, the phone calls at odd hours, the small loans that were never repaid, the holidays Ray simply didn't show up for, followed by long silences that sometimes stretched for the better part of a year. He said the family had cycled through every stage of response over the decades: anger, desperate intervention attempts, and eventually, for most of them, a kind of exhausted resignation, a quiet decision to simply protect themselves by expecting less. Nathan told me he understood that response completely, had felt it himself more than once, and yet had never quite been able to fully let go of the specific hope his father had planted the last time the two of them spoke seriously about Ray's future. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who has ever discovered an unexplained object or expense in a marriage and felt that same disorienting mix of confusion and quiet worry. I think it's worth remembering that not every hidden thing points toward betrayal. Sometimes it points toward a grief or a hope so complicated the person carrying it hasn't yet found the right moment or the right words to bring it fully into the light. In other words, the mystery I had stumbled into wasn't a locked door hiding something meant to stay hidden from me specifically. It was a private room built for someone else entirely, someone Nathan had spent a decade quietly holding space for, long before he ever imagined needing to explain that space to a wife who hadn't yet entered his life when the promise itself was first made. Nathan told me that in the chaotic weeks after their father's death, sorting through Gerald's modest estate, most of the family had assumed the old pickup truck would simply be sold along with the rest of his belongings. Nathan had stopped that plan quietly, paying the difference himself to keep the truck out of the estate sale, telling the rest of the family only that he wanted to hold on to it for sentimental reasons, a plausible enough explanation that no one questioned further. The fuller reason, he told me, was Ray. Their father had promised Ray, in one of his more lucid, hopeful periods years earlier, that the truck would be his once he got fully sober and rebuilt a stable life. A promise Gerald made not as an ultimatum but as a quiet expression of belief that Ray was capable of getting there eventually. When Gerald died before that promise could be fulfilled, Nathan told me he had made a private decision, one he never discussed with the rest of the family, to keep that promise alive on his father's behalf, however long it took. In other words, what I had mistaken for a confusing hour as some strange, unexplained secret was in fact an entire decade of quiet, patient faith, kept alive in the specific, tangible shape of a truck sitting in a rented garage, waiting for a brother most of the family had already, privately, stopped expecting to change. He told me about the specific arrangement he had maintained all those years, driving out to the garage every few months to start the engine, keep the battery charged, run it through the neighborhood briefly to keep the tires and fluids from deteriorating, the small, unglamorous maintenance required to keep a decade-old promise mechanically ready the moment it might finally be needed. He told me he had never once mentioned it to Ray directly, afraid that raising the promise too early, before Ray was truly ready, might feel like pressure rather than the quiet, patient faith he intended it to be. He described, too, the specific cost of maintaining that arrangement over 10 years, the monthly garage rental, the periodic maintenance, small expenses that added up over a decade into a real sum of money he had simply folded quietly into our budget under a category I'd never thought to question closely. He told me he had also kept a small folder of paperwork updated the entire time: insurance records, registration renewals, the truck legally still registered to their late father's estate in a careful arrangement their family lawyer had helped him set up. All of it maintained precisely so that the truck would be ready to transfer the moment it was finally needed, with no bureaucratic delay standing between Ray and the promise once he was ready to receive it. He also told me about the handful of times over the years when he had nearly given up on the arrangement himself, particularly after a difficult relapse when Ray disappeared from contact entirely for the better part of 18 months, a stretch during which Nathan told me he genuinely questioned whether he was being faithful or simply stubborn, whether the truck sitting quietly in that garage was hope or denial dressed up in the same clothes. He said what kept him going, in the end, wasn't blind optimism, but a simple, stubborn refusal to be the one who finally closed the door his father had spent years trying to keep open. I asked him, gently, why he had never told me across 11 years of marriage. He told me it hadn't been about distrust, but about protecting himself in a way, from having to explain a hope that most people in his life had quietly given up on. He said that every time someone learned about Ray's ongoing struggles, they eventually, kindly but firmly, encouraged Nathan to protect himself by lowering his expectations, and he had found it easier, over the years, to simply keep the truck's existence private rather than continually defend a faith he sometimes struggled to fully explain, even to himself. I sat with him at our kitchen table for a long while after he finished, turning over 11 years of an unexplained object I had never once noticed the absence of, understanding, finally, exactly what it had been quietly protecting all along. I felt no anger at all, only a slow, deepening tenderness for a man who had carried a decade of patient hope for his brother so quietly that he had let even his own wife believe, without ever questioning it, that a rented garage space simply wasn't worth mentioning. I asked him that same evening whether he had ever doubted his own decision to keep waiting, whether some part of him resented carrying a hope so many other people around him had quietly abandoned. He told me the honest answer was yes, more than once, especially during Ray's hardest stretches, when maintaining faith felt less like optimism and more like stubbornness he couldn't fully justify even to himself. But he said he had made a private peace with the possibility that the truck might simply sit in that garage forever, unclaimed, and that keeping the promise regardless, even without guarantee of the outcome he hoped for, had felt like the only version of loyalty to his father and to his brother that he could live with offering. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation, because I think the way it eventually resolved matters as much as the 11 years of not knowing that came before. About 8 months after I found those keys, Ray called Nathan on an ordinary Tuesday evening, his voice steadier than either of us had heard it in years, to tell him he had just passed his 1-year mark of sobriety, the longest stretch he had managed since his early 20s, and that he finally felt ready to talk about what came next in his life. Nathan told him about the truck that same call, the promise their father had made years earlier, the decade he had spent quietly keeping it alive, and I could hear, even from across the room, the long silence that followed on the other end of the line before Ray finally spoke again, his voice thick with an emotion I didn't need to see to understand completely. Nathan told me after he hung up that Ray had asked quietly whether he really meant it, whether the truck had truly been sitting there the entire time, through every relapse, every silence, every year Ray himself had assumed his family had simply written him off. Nathan told him yes, every single year, and Ray had gone quiet again for a long moment before saying, in a voice Nathan said he would never forget, that he hadn't realized until that exact moment how much he had needed someone to still be waiting. I met Ray properly for the first time in the months that followed, a cautious, still fragile version of a man rebuilding his life, one deliberate choice at a time, and I watched Nathan hand him the keys to that truck in our driveway on a bright Saturday morning, both brothers crying openly in a way I don't think either of them had allowed themselves to do together in years. Ray told me, later that same afternoon, that knowing the truck had been waiting for him all that time, whether he ever managed to earn it or not, had become one of the quiet things he held on to during his hardest, most tempted nights, proof that at least one person in his life had never fully stopped believing he could get there. I watched him run his hands slowly along the truck's dashboard that morning, tracing a small crack in the vinyl that had been there since he was a teenager. And he told us a story neither of us had heard before, about the summer their father taught him to drive on a stretch of empty back road outside town, patient in a way Ray said he hadn't fully appreciated until he became an adult himself and understood exactly how much patience raising a difficult son actually required. He said sitting behind that same wheel again, sober, felt like being handed back a version of himself he'd assumed, for years, was permanently lost. Ray stayed for dinner that evening, the four of us, Nathan, Ray, myself, and Ray's sponsor from his recovery program, a quiet, steady man named Carlos, who Ray credited, in large part, with helping him finally reach the stability that had eluded him for over a decade. Carlos told me, near the end of the evening, that in his years working with people in early recovery, he had rarely seen a family member hold on to hope as concretely and as patiently as Nathan had, and that stories like this one, tangible proof that someone never stopped believing, mattered more to people rebuilding their lives than most families ever realized. I think about those 11 years often now, the specific ache of discovering an unexplained set of keys that I initially feared pointed towards something painful, and I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who has ever found an unexplained object or pattern in someone they love, not every hidden thing protects a wrongdoing. Sometimes it protects a fragile, stubborn hope that the person carrying it has learned to guard quietly, simply because hope, unlike almost everything else, tends to survive best when it isn't constantly asked to defend itself out loud. I think, too, about the specific courage it must have taken Nathan to keep believing in his brother across so many disappointments, year after year, without any guarantee that his patience would ever be rewarded. It would have been so much easier, at almost any point along the way, to quietly sell the truck, redirect the money elsewhere, and simply accept the same resigned conclusion the rest of the family had already reached. That he never did, that he kept choosing hope again and again in the privacy of a rented garage no one else even knew existed, taught me more about the quiet, unglamorous shape of real loyalty than almost anything else I've witnessed in our marriage. I want to offer a few reflections for anyone listening who recognizes their own version of this story, some quiet, unexplained pattern in someone they love that never quite added up until the truth finally arrived. Know that faith in a struggling person doesn't have to be loud to be real. Nathan never once lectured Ray about getting sober, never made his love conditional on visible progress. He simply kept a promise ready, quietly, for as long as it took, and let his brother find his own way back to it in his own time. Understand that hope, especially hope for someone caught in addiction, is often fragile enough that the person holding it learns to protect it from other people's well-meaning discouragement. Nathan's silence about the truck wasn't secrecy in any troubling sense. It was simply his way of guarding a hope too precious to risk having talked out of him. Give yourself permission to hold uncertainty patiently before assuming the worst. I could have let that unfamiliar set of keys quietly become a source of lasting doubt in my marriage. Instead, I gave Nathan room to explain in his own time, and that patience allowed a far gentler, more moving truth to eventually find its way to me. Learn that supporting someone through addiction rarely looks the way movies or television suggest it should. There was no dramatic intervention in this story, no single speech that changed everything. There was only a decade of quiet, unglamorous consistency. A truck kept running, a promise kept ready, patience extended long after most people around him had reasonably run out of it. Remember that some promises outlive the person who made them, and honoring those promises, quietly and without fanfare, is one of the deepest forms of love a person can offer both the dead and the living. Nathan kept his father's promise alive for a decade without ever being asked to, simply because he believed it still mattered. Recognize that people fighting addiction often carry an enormous, private fear that they've already used up everyone's patience, that the people who once believed in them have quietly moved on. Nathan's truck stood as concrete proof against that fear for Ray, something he could point to and know, without needing to ask, that at least one door had never actually closed. And believe, finally, that the people we love most often carry entire private worlds of devotion we know nothing about, not out of deception, but out of care for someone else's fragile, ongoing recovery. Sometimes all it takes is one honest evening at a kitchen table and the courage to finally ask a gentle question to understand the fuller shape of who they truly are. Consider too how quietly we sometimes judge people for hopes we assume are naive without ever asking what those hopes have already cost the person holding them. From the outside, a decade-old truck sitting unused in a rented garage might have looked, to some, like denial dressed up as loyalty. Underneath it was 11 years of careful, deliberate faith, chosen again and again, long after it would have been easier and far more socially acceptable to simply let it go. Ray still drives that truck today, 3 years sober now, working steadily, slowly rebuilding a life that once seemed, to nearly everyone around him, permanently out of reach. He keeps a small photograph of their father tucked into the visor, and Nathan tells me Ray still calls him sometimes just to say he's driving somewhere ordinary, a grocery store, a doctor's appointment, small unremarkable errands that once would have felt impossible to imagine. Last month, Ray drove that truck to our house for Sunday dinner, something that has become, over the past year, its own quiet new tradition. And I watched him pull into our driveway with an ease that still occasionally catches me off guard, remembering how impossible this exact ordinary moment once seemed. He brought Nathan a small gift that evening, a new set of keys cut and polished to match the original worn ones exactly, telling him, half joking and half entirely serious, that he wanted Nathan to have a spare in case he ever needed to borrow the truck back for old time's sake. Nathan keeps that second set in the same kitchen drawer now, no longer hidden, no longer unexplained, simply another small, visible piece of a story our whole family finally understands. I think often about how close I came to letting one unfamiliar set of keys quietly become a source of doubt between us. And I am endlessly grateful that patience, and eventually the truth itself, showed me exactly what my husband had been quietly keeping alive all along. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.